Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Kia ora, and welcome into the Hoon, everyone. I'm Bernard Hickey, co-host with co-host Peter Bale in Hoon Bay this week.
Bernard, it's very nice to see you. Yeah, I was just talking briefly to our friend Mark Dalder, who introduced me when I first came back to New Zealand to the Bird of the Year, and it just occurred to me, of course, that with your readership, we could possibly get the kaka up there. Is the kaka often in there? Because it's not a full choice, is it?
The kaka is in there this year. In fact, I had a note from a student at a Nelson school saying, we're proposing the kaka and we want you to support us. So I'm very keen.
Yeah.
The trouble is the kaka is like one of those always also rans. And what we really need is you to use your contacts with the Daily Show or
good idea to get the kaka. Yeah.
What's this, John Oliver? No,
yeah.
John Oliver. Yeah, John Oliver. Get him to go for the kaka this year, and we definitely win.
That's a very good idea. Well, yeah, but of course I will be supporting. I don't know whether it's in. Is it? Did they announce the finalists this year? I think they have.
I haven't. No, we're still early on.
Early in the nomination
contest
phase
of the year.
Because mine is usually the variable oyster catcher.
Oh, yeah.
Which is, I always think variable must be its personality rather than its plumage, and it's a very neglected and rather lovely bird, and I like the way that it pairs for life. It would appear, as far as I can tell. I mean, I haven't done what my brother does with paradise ducks and shot one of them, and he always says you get 2 for 1 because its partner comes back.
Too much information. No,
yes.
kaka. I'm
different
all for
brother
the
from the other one, by the way.
Yeah. Different. The kaka is my absolute favourite, as you can probably tell, and particularly this week, where I've done a couple of my recordings of the dawn choruses outside, and had in the middle of the recordings groups of kaka swooping over, screeching loudly, and it's been quite a thrill.
Fantastic.
Actually.
Well, I think I've told you or sent to you even some pictures of this chap, Stuart Farquhar, who in the Birds of New Zealand Facebook feed that I follow, which I know it's not quite as, the nerdiest Facebook feed that I follow is Seagull Outboard Motor Enthusiasts, because I'm in love with one, I don't have one yet. Well, I have my father's one from 1957, but yeah.
Is there also a Facebook group for repairing the Seagull Outboard Motor?
They don't need repairs. They don't, and they always start first time. But Stuart Farquhar takes the most amazing pictures of the kakas on Great Barrier, but he won't let me connect with you to get some of them for the kaka because he says he's not into self-promotion or kaka promotion. But anyway, now Bernard, speaking of the kaka and self-promotion, I went to a really interesting lecture the other night by Gavin Ellis, the former editor of the Herald, now Dr. Gavin Ellis, and a very accomplished academic, which is a fantastic sort of late in life transfer that he's done, or reinvention. And a chap came up to me and said, "I just want to thank you guys for the kaka, for the Hoon. I'm a regular listener." And these were our people, Bernard. There were a couple of hundred of them. It was a thing that Auckland University puts on, which is the alumni to Auckland University, and it's a set of lectures, sort of an hour long lectures in bars all over Auckland. It's a really interesting phenomenon, and I think we need to get you in there, or we do a live thing of the live recording in front of an audience of the kaka.
Yes. Well, we can put the word out now. Would people come along to a live recording of the kaka?
I think we know they would.
With a few sparkling beverages.
Yes.
Or even sparkling water.
Yeah.
And that would be fun.
Well, we might have to wear something. I just realised we're both wearing what my daughter calls dad clothes today, it would appear. She often says to me, has said to me, "Dad, you've got such beautiful clothes in your cupboard. Why are you wearing dad clothes?"
Yeah. No, that's us, dad clothes. We'll try and avoid the dad jokes this week.
Yeah. Hey, so we sometimes talk about media. Is that all right? Or should we talk about what we've got coming? So I've been wondering about media. Mark Dalder, we were just talking about, has just published a really interesting story, I thought, saying that New Zealand First had already written the kind of provisional legislation for the fast track plan before it came into office, and that it already had identified gold and coal mines specifically before before the legislation came in. Apart from Mark, I'm concerned that I'm not really seeing as much kind of holding to account, one might say. I mean, Guyan Espiner did an amazing job, I thought, on Casey Costello and the mysterious document that she just happened to send to all of her officials and can't for the life of her remember where it came from. There's a lot going on in that political world that I'm worried is not being fully understood or fully followed up, other than by you, Bernard, and Mark Dalder.
Yeah, Mark's doing a great job. I think that one actually came also from Newsroom from Fox Myer. But Mark is, and Fox and the team at Newsroom who are always doing a fantastic job. I cheer them on from a distance now, but I'm a huge supporter and actually...
But do you think there's a lack of... I know... Esperan's doing great work, but we've got some very interesting sort of bigger debates, and I think we've discussed this a little bit before. But this description by Shane Jones of a High Court judge, a Supreme Court judge, actually, I think, as a communist, is pretty outrageous. And you've got this kind of rather unpleasant banter going on. It's worse than banter. This kind of sarcasm. Elected judges. Thank God we don't have elected judges here. And in the treatment of the Treaty of Waitangi, there's a really interesting schism developing. And I'm hoping to have in a couple of weeks a very powerful or influential, interesting guest on that topic, because this coalition seems to me to be messing with some pretty important constitutional and historic factors, whether it's the Treaty of Waitangi or the Waitangi Tribunal, or particularly the Supreme Court and the Appeal Court and its ability to interpret the Treaty of Waitangi, which is central to our constitution, such as it is.
Yes, it's really concerning, and we've actually had notes to that extent from the Law Society, I think, in the last day or so. We've heard this week the testing of both Christopher Luxon and Winston Peters on the issue of whether sovereignty was assumed, transferred, given, taken by the Crown, and it's very interesting to see this come up. You're right, it is concerning, and also Winston Peters just dropping in Parliament that he's not a real believer in climate change.
Exactly. I know. Well, I was going to bring that up when you come on to Catherine, but I think I've invited Vincent O'Malley. Sorry, Vincent O'Sullivan's just died, so there couldn't be. He would be hard to get. But Vincent O'Malley, the historian of Te Ao Māori, or of particularly of the land wars, of the New Zealand wars, I've invited him on, and hopefully when he's finished travelling the country promoting his new book about the Waikato, available from Bridget, what's her name, books? Bridget Williams?
Yep, that's right.
He will come on and talk to us about the significance of these treaty discussions and why things like the word sovereignty matters, and how laws and treaties get interpreted over time.
Yeah, the government is playing with some fire here, and we've already seen this week the revelations about Paul Goldsmith, the treaty negotiations minister, just telling some lobbyists, just by the by, that changes to the foreshore and seabed legislation would reduce the ability for iwi to claim 100% down to 5%. He didn't seem to think that was a problem. And it's interesting that the level of opposition and cohesion of Te Ao Māori against the government at this early stage is quite remarkable. Yeah,
and I think again, I'm not sure that the issues here are being well enough explained. I do think we need cut out and keep guides, bullet point primers and explanations of how we got here. Now, speaking of seabed and foreshore, it's hotting up in the seabed, Catherine. Hi.
Hello. Catherine.
Kia ora.
Great to see you. And becoming more acidified. Catherine, this week on our climate wrap, there's more detail that will come out tomorrow, but acidification in the ocean. Tell us about what's going on there and how it's being explained to people. I mean, Peter's looking for explanations and easy ways to understand. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we've included a link to this site that has some really great charts that have, you know, how you can have those climate stripes that show the change in temperature of surface air temperature over time. Well, they've got the same thing for ocean acidification. And so you can go to this website and you can pull up any of the main ocean basins, so Pacific, Atlantic, whatever, but also you can pull up different marine ecosystems to look more closely at exactly how much acidification is happening there and have a look at the climate stripes that result from it. So we talked about this last week a little bit with oceans. We were saying how about 25% of the carbon dioxide emissions that human activity creates is being absorbed by the oceans. And of course, that's leading to this problem of acidification, which basically means that even if our emissions weren't heating the atmosphere, we would still need to rapidly reduce our use of fossil fuels and our emissions because of what they're doing to the oceans. And this is another planetary boundary, ocean acidification.
Yes, and it's quite a shocking thing to see how in our ocean we're seeing a big change towards acidification, and right around the planet, it's a thing.
And am I right in thinking, Catherine, that it's the acidification that causes problems for mollusks and invertebrates and shelled creatures that you get? You know, if it gets more acidic, it's much harder for them to form shell material.
Yes, that's right, absolutely. And for coral reefs as well. Well, the heating is responsible for the bleaching specifically of those, but a lot of those, the mollusks and the shelled things happen around coral reefs as well. So, yeah.
And Catherine, what do you make of what Antonio Guterres said at the Pacific Forum, in Tonga? I mean, he issued this rather alarming new report on sea temperatures and covered some of the things you're talking about. Is anybody listening?
That's a really good question. I talk about this stuff all the time, and I do sometimes wonder if anybody's listening to me. I mean, he talked about
Catherine,
the fact that...
Did you get the sense that people there were listening? Go ahead.
Is somebody frozen up here?
Yeah, you. It's all right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we've talked before about the warming seas around New Zealand. So we know from statistics, New Zealand reports that that the seas around New Zealand are heating up 2 to 3 times faster than the global average. And that is essentially what he was saying about the Pacific region. Guterres was saying that in the Pacific region that the oceans are heating up at 3 times the rate that they are in other parts of the world, and that oceans are warming faster and sea levels are climbing faster than what anybody anticipated or what is currently in the models. So
are you saying my seafront cliff here might be in trouble, or is he?
Yeah,
UN and the WEF are trying to take my seafront away from me.
Yeah, I got to say I wouldn't be buying seafront property at the moment, but
I just have. Yeah.
And Catherine, he likes to call a spade, Mr. Guterres. And when he was asked by some New Zealand journalists about New Zealand's decision to restart selling licenses for offshore exploration, he didn't mince his words, basically saying, "Yeah, you can find it, but you won't be burning it."
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the timelines involved in exploration and then using this stuff, I think, the world is going to be actually a different place by the time we actually get to the point of burning that stuff. And there's going to be, I hope, a lot less tolerance of people continuing to contribute to that issue and not making real efforts to do anything about it. So, yeah, there are some real... I guess you could say moral jeopardy, but hazards and risks in front of companies that are investing a lot of money into doing this is the fact that they might end up with, their assets isolated and not of any value to them in the future. So,
yeah. And Catherine, also in this week's wrap, you've got some studies of policies that work to actually reduce emissions. 1,500 policies were studied around the world, and how many actually made a difference?
Yeah, no, this was a brilliant piece of research. They looked at 1,500 different climate policies that took place in 41 countries and 6 continents over 25 years. So it's a really, really broad study that's looking at, and they also there's one capability that they had with the study that hasn't been done before that's quite important. They were able to look at mixes of policies and to see how how much they gained from complementary, and how they interacted and what benefits you got from that. So that's a big improvement from just being able to look at individual policies and what the outcomes were. And they kind of worked backwards. They started looking at where did we see big decreases in emissions, and then were there policies or sets of policies that happened, that precipitated that decrease that were responsible for it. And they found a grand total of 63 interventions that were related to successful policies out of the 1,500. And those 63 interventions, they were mixes of policies, they weren't individual policies. They were responsible for between 0.6 billion and 1.8 billion metric tonnes of carbon dioxide reduction over the study period of 25 years. Now, just to put that into some context, we are globally emitting something like 35 billion metric tonnes of carbon dioxide every year. So it's a relatively modest sum, shall we put it that way?
Yeah, and it just shows you how much work needs to be done. And you can see that too in some analysis of our government's reaction to calls for more emissions reductions and signs that actually we're not reducing emissions much at all. We're relying on pine forests, and we'll talk about that later with Aaron Smale. Pine forests and also unproven carbon capture technologies. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this is something else that we've talked about before in terms of the emissions reduction plan, but there were a couple of charts that Christina Hood, who is an expert on carbon markets and climate policy,
and a friend of the podcast.
Yeah,
friend of the podcast.
Yep.
She put these out on her LinkedIn profile this week, and I thought they were really, really interesting because they showed really clearly they had a big. They showed the emissions budgets and what policies were happening in order to reduce emissions and meet those budgets. And in orange, there was this part that showed gross emissions reduction. So that's how much we are actually just reducing the amount of emissions that we put out into the air, as opposed to offsetting it with pine or forestry. And she compared what the government's proposed plan was with the middle range of what the Climate Change Commission had recommended. So it wasn't their most ambitious recommendation or their least ambitious, it was their middle one. And you see this big orange part of the graph, which is gross emissions reductions. When you look at the government's plan, it's a teeny tiny thin little stripe. Right across out to 2047. And when you dig into what that stripe is, it's based a lot on assumptions about what their carbon capture and storage plan is going to deliver. All of the rest of either meeting or not meeting the future emissions reduction budgets, all of it is taken up with forestry, most of it pine, some of it new native forestry. So and there's also a bunch of assumptions built into that in terms of what you not only will be able to plant, but what you'll still be able to keep.
Catherine, I just noticed also ExxonMobil, that rather wonderful company that we've grown to know and love over the years, forecast this week that 2050 energy demand will be exactly the same as it is today, and that's a 25% higher forecast than BP, and from the world's largest oil company, if you exclude for a minute Saudi Aramco. But that is an extraordinary idea that for 2050 we're just going to continue on consuming and pumping out, and even by 2050 we might have another gas field.
Is this their energy demand for fossil fuels, or
it's Exxon's view of expects crude demand to stay above 100 million barrels per day through until 2050.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that is,
It doesn't include
There's-
gas, of course, but yeah, carry on.
there's also this idea that we actually passed peak oil as well a few years ago. So
Yeah.
whether they can actually continue to pump at that rate is another question altogether. But I'm not surprised that that's what they're forecasting. And in fact, when you look at what happened at the last COP, the last COP out, I guess, they were looking at, the fact that, their position was that you should be able to continue to pump oil, and we will just take it out of the atmosphere later.
Yeah,
through carbon
which was
capture and storage or
definitely
through
the view
other-
of the Abu Dhabi
Yeah.
National Oil Company, who was the chairman of the COP. Yeah.
Yeah, and what we've seen since then, particularly in the US, what's happening there in terms of exposing ExxonMobil and Shell and all of those companies for greenwashing in terms of their claims about CCS that they don't even believe themselves. So the idea that those technologies are going to be able to operate at the scale that we are already starting to rely on them, that's a big question mark. And actually there's another article that we've mentioned in the Climate Wrap this week that is in the Conversation UK that talks exactly about that, the problem of our assumptions that we have built in around overshooting 1.5 degrees and whether we can or should rely on those assumptions and what that means. It's a must-read article, in my opinion. I think
also,
everybody
Catherine,
needs to get their heads around it.
Interestingly, in response to this idea that he was downplaying the human impact of climate change, Winston Peters did say something that isn't completely mad, but it was about the difference between preparation and defenses against the consequences as opposed to abatement.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely underinvestment in adaptation and developing in the developing part of the world. There isn't enough money going into that. And I would suggest that for places like Pacific Islands, a lot of their focus should be on adaptation and not on mitigation. That does.
Catherine, let me just tell you that the audience is one of Mike Joy just says you're a gem. Artie
Thanks,
Farty
Mike.
87 says good one, Catherine, which I think was about it being a cop out. So people are really appreciating it, and there's huge love in there for Bernard because people know that he doesn't look at the comments and I do. Speaking of huge love, here's our resident most loved Professor of International Affairs.
Robert, welcome in.
You said that, Peter, just the way I wrote it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, apart from the fact that you and I've just appointed you to go to Sudan to run the peace talks there. How are you? What's on the top?
You want
of
to
your mind?
escalate the situation.
Yeah, exactly. Kill them all, let God sort them out. Yeah. We thought we might do a bit of a tour of the horizon, tour of the world today, because I don't have somebody from Lebanon at the moment. I think she's probably hopefully under her bed with a crash helmet on, and I've asked a couple of people from Ukraine, but they're a tad busy as well. Let's do a little bit of a tour around some of the hotspots at the moment. The Israeli move overnight into the West Bank seems rather shocking. Of course, they have the right to defend themselves against terrorists, although I was extraordinarily struck by the Israeli spokesman, Mr. Menser, not M-E-N-S-A, M-E-N-S-E-R, I believe, describing the West Bank as Sumeria, which is a sort of very strong trope amongst the settlers about Judea and Samaria being a natural place to go and the home of the Jews and so on. What do you think's going on there? Israel just keeps seeming or Jerusalem, to Tel Aviv, whichever way we're going to describe the capital, or Netanyahu, pushing into these additional hotspots.
Well, this is a far-right coalition led by Netanyahu, and Israel has a right of self-defense, but that right of self-defense is not limitless, and particularly when it's occurring in illegally occupied territory. And the other worrying thing is there's been, since the Hamas terrorist attack of the 7th of October, more than 500 Palestinians, many of them very young Palestinians, have been killed in the West Bank. And there have been repeated raids. And also there's been a repeated annexation of territory. This has drawn expressions of concern and regret from Washington, but these are basically slaps on the wrist. And that's unfortunate because the United States really does have leverage in this situation. The United States says it wants a two-state solution, but it seems to be powerless to object by the trajectory in which Israel is taking, which is to rule out that prospect by gradually settling the territories under its control.
Gradually and quite rapidly as well. It's very, it's semi-official. I think we talked last week about this movie in the film festival.
This is just a blatant breach of international law.
Yeah,
and it's no good talking about a rules-based order if you can't uphold it, whether it be in the Red Sea, Gaza, or the West Bank, or anywhere else.
Now, there was another really interesting provocation this week, Robert, with Itamar Ben-Gvir going to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or not so much to the mosque, but going to the Temple Mount and appearing to pray with because there is this. If you remember, I think it was Sharon went to Temple Mount, at a critical moment in this. The unofficial but sort of accepted wisdom is that Jews pray at the Western Wall, Muslims pray in and on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Jews can visit the Temple Mount, but they don't pray, and he seems to have breached that again this week. And it's all about, you're seeing these people talk about settling that problem, building a synagogue on the Temple Mount. This is extraordinarily sort of like the touch paper and stand well clear kind of stuff.
And Al-Aqsa is an incredibly holy site for Muslims and Palestinians in particular. So, there's been a lot of emphasis on the rights of the Israelis to defend themselves. There's been an almost neglect or omission of the rights of Palestinians. And it's not just happening in the West Bank or Gaza, it's happening also in East Jerusalem. And, people are losing their property that generations of Palestinians have been living from. And the other thing that worries me about the West Bank is not just American reticence to say anything. Oh, yes, they have sanctioned a few individual settlers, but what that is, if I may say so, a very timid response to a situation in which the Israeli army accompanies the settlers and also watches as they annex territory, vandalize Palestinian property, and sometimes assault Palestinians, and they just stand there and watch.
Yeah,
and for too long, liberal democracies have remained, I think, complicit with their silence in what's happening, and what's happening in at the moment is a stain on humanity. It really is. It's a dreadful situation. Oh, and the thing that really worries me, Peter. Ben-Gvir, the minister you were just referring to, who wanted to build a synagogue on the Temple Mount site, or the Al-Aqsa site, as the Palestinians call it.
Can you imagine that?
Yeah, talk about provocative.
Yeah.
But, this is, to me, this is a government, a right-wing government, and you quite rightly, many centrists in Israel thoroughly disapprove of Ben-Gvir. Some Israeli commentators, many of them have a very good sense of humour, calling him the Minister of National Insecurity. But the point to note here is these actions being taken by this right-wing coalition are not making Israel more secure.
No, exactly. They're jeopardising
it. And it's irrelevant whether they annihilate Hamas or not, because they have killed so many innocent people in the process, seized territory illegally, and that is only going to fuel another generation of hatred with some organisation which will take up the call to channel that hatred. So this is very regrettable, and the challenge, as we've said many times, is to recognise the Israelis' justifiable need to live within secure boundaries. But that has to be married or reconciled with the Palestinians' legitimate desire for political self-determination, which is being denied.
And Robert, pulling out a little bit from that, Iran may be fomenting this in the West Bank. That's what this guy Mentzer, the Israeli spokesman, says. Hezbollah, it's obviously supporting Hezbollah and whatever is remaining of Hamas. But Iran has not staged any sort of spectacular still, and yet we see the peace talks stalled. Do you think that there is some interesting back channel going on between the United States and Iran at the moment, similar to the one that Bernard sent you an excellent story from Dmitry Sevastopol from the FT about there being a really interesting back channel, as one would hope there is, between Beijing and Washington? Do you think there's a back channel between Washington and Iran?
It's a pretty remote back channel. I wouldn't rule it out happening, though, because
did you call it a back channel or back channel?
Bit of both, I think.
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. I think there's some. I think the Americans have definitely made overtures to the Iranians, because the Americans from the outset have been fully aware of the potential for the Gaza situation to inflame a much wider region, and they're very worried that Iran will become involved, and that has involved, of course, the dispatch of warships to the Red Sea. But it's also, in the past, America has taken steps, along with allies, including New Zealand, to try to deal with the illegal actions of Iranian allies in the region, such as the Houthis.
Yeah,
and,
it's interesting to me how
I think the Americans are very conscious of the. No, I was just going to say, the problem is, I think, 2 points. Firstly, the Iranians may be stirring it in the West Bank, but they shouldn't be given the opportunity to stir it by denial of self-determination in that region. Of course they're going to take advantage of it. They've been a big winner from Gaza. Strategically, the United States has inflated Iran's influence in the region. And the second point is the United States, in a sense, one way of to try to arrest Iran's influence would be to prevail on Israel to have a ceasefire in Gaza, because the absence of a ceasefire is grist to the mill of Iran and its allies in the region. It gives their message of defiance real meaning to lots of people who'd rather not have anything to do with them, and that's unfortunate. And so I think those points need to be, seriously considered.
Thank you, Robert.
Robert, I was wondering if we could talk about AUKUS. There's been plenty of debate and an intensifying debate over the ditch in Australia. Could you tell us about how that's going and whether there's any prospect for a shift?
Not yet, but I think there's a bit of momentum building. I think the penny is beginning to drop. Not really amongst both the major parties in Australia, but certainly there's growing signs of unease in the military, and also some senior public servants and former public servants, such as Hugh White, we mentioned before. But it's not just Hugh White. You've got former politicians like Turnbull, Keating, speaking out and saying this is not a mistake. This is a strategic disaster for the United States, which is extreme for Australia. I beg your pardon, which is extremely expensive. It's the scale of the response. And the other thing I think, which is beginning to have a sting in the tail, or make some Australians have some sort of buyer's remorse, is the fact they've had to give quite ironclad undertakings about their financial commitments. They're not getting a reciprocal undertaking about the precise date these submarines will arrive. And we mentioned this before, but Hugh White and Malcolm Turnbull are both sceptical the nuclear power submarines will actually arrive.
Of course.
As scheduled in the 2030s. I think the date is 2033. The first Virginia class submarines are supposed to arrive. And
perhaps they should ask for a lay-by deal.
Well, it is, but I think I think that there's beginning. It's one thing. I mean, this decision by Labour to sign up was done incredibly quickly to this Scott Morrison initiative, and I think there is some thinking through the consequences now, and we just can't predict how it's going to go. I think what would accelerate the process of pushback in Australia is if Mr. Trump was elected. I don't think that's going to happen. It doesn't look like it's going to happen at this stage. But I still think, even if Kamala Harris and Timothy Waltz are the ticket and they prevail and they get into the White House, I still think there's going to be problems for Australia, largely funding this enhanced security arrangement.
Right, well, they can do it by selling more iron ore to China.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a possibility, of course.
Yeah, uranium.
There's no shortage. I mean, China is. They never sanctioned when they did sanction Australia. The Chinese were very careful to exclude iron ore from the list of products they didn't want or they sanctioned. So yeah, you're absolutely right. But I think that we just have to watch this unfolding debate that's occurring in Australia. But what I have noticed, to answer your question directly, is that some people are beginning to speak out who are previously quiet, and that's interesting. The debate seemed to start off with a bit of a rant from Paul Keating, but it has slowly gathered momentum, and it's going to be interesting to see. There's some pretty, as we've discussed this before, there's, particularly in Australian think tanks, but also in the universities, there's some pretty pragmatic people coming out against AUKUS, and it's going to be interesting to see how
am I
this
right
plays
in
out.
thinking, Robert, that the Lowy Institute or at least an analyst at the Lowy Institute, seem remarkably positive about it?
No, one of the biggest critics of AUKUS is Sam Roggeveen, who's at Lowy. He's written a book on this subject, and he's got two major objections to Australia's participation in AUKUS. Firstly, he believes it's placing too many eggs in the American strategic basket. He is worried that Australia is conflating its own national security needs with the grand strategy needs of the United States. He said, which could be set different. He said that the interests of Australia, they converge with the United States, but they're not identical.
Yeah.
And that point was highlighted recently when Kurt Campbell made some quite unguarded comments about, in the event of a showdown occurring over Taiwan, he didn't rule out the possibility that Australian submarines would be nuclear power submarines would be dispatched to deal with it, and that left many Australians thinking, is AUKUS about primacy, a US primacy, or is it about enhancing Australian national security? I think the other big doubt for Australians is not just become too dependent on the United States, but also I think the other thing is just the practical side of it. Will it actually embolden China? Because in the interim, while they're waiting for these nuclear power submarines to arrive, that's a considerable time interval, and they're having to cut back on military preparedness and military exercises, which they need to do in order to signal to the Chinese that is there a conflict, that Australia's ready and will defend itself.
Robert, before we move to sorry, Bernard, do you mind? I was going to go to Ukraine for a minute, but do you want to have another question about AUKUS?
You go. Yep.
Robert, there's not to again turn you into an armchair warrior, of course, but the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk still seems to be progressing and solidifying. The Russian response in the Donbass seems to be progressing and solidifying. I saw a description this week that they're fighting two different wars and not necessarily against each other. That there's sort of these two parallel lines going past each other. What are you making of this? Well,
Mr. Putin's doing more of the same, but he's not containing a new problem, not containing it satisfactorily. And I think that is going to cause political problems, and in fact is causing political problems, because we're now funny you should mention this, Peter, in the last few days we're beginning to get indirect criticism of Putin's leadership in official state media. That is quite a significant development. The Russian military is being positioned to halt the Kursk offensive, but it's taking a long time. The other thing is, and you've probably noticed this, there's been a number of spectacular drone attacks on Russia in the last few days. Rostov-on-Don is a particularly, they're losing their, this was the center of the invasion of Ukraine. This was the center where all the operations were based in Rostov. And they have suffered a calamitous drone attack there, which has really undermined their storage, their fuel storage capacity, which apparently, according to some reporters, military reporters, is causing some fuel shortages already in the Russian, part of Ukraine which Russia occupies. So it's Mr. Putin has taken the view that he can push on despite the Kursk offensive, and he's saying it's the new normal. He's trying to depict it as Mr. Peskov, the spin doctor for Mr. Putin, is saying it's the new normal that this terrorist operation is occurring in Kursk region, but it's also spread to Belgorod.
Yep.
I'm just wondering how long people within Mr. Putin's circle are going to accept that this is the new normal, because I always think it's very dangerous when you have a so-called strongman regime, inverted commas, that is not strong enough to defend the internationally recognized borders of Russia.
Yeah, absolutely.
It seems to me, because it's an authoritarian state, we're not going to be tipped off in advance when there's going to be a possible move against Putin's leadership, just as we weren't tipped off in advance when Prigozhin made that abortive coup attempt. But I think it's creating, I think the Kursk offensive is creating a climate where something like that could happen unless the Russians can really crush the Kursk offensive in the very near future.
Robert, excellent. Thank you so much. We're going to move to slightly more domestic issues, but thank you as usual. And I was going to ask you, but I'll ask you next week about you appearing on Sean Plunkett and why. But we'll talk about that next week, please.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert.
Right.
And I'd like to welcome in for the first time to the Hoon, Aaron Smale, a journalist and author of a new book, but actually, I frankly think a bit of a hero. I am proud of my involvement in helping to set up Newsroom, and Aaron has been very involved in doing some amazing journalism with and through Newsroom. Aaron, thank you very much for coming on to the Hoon. Lovely to see you.
Aaron, hi. I'll ask you some separate questions, but Bernard's going to lead on trees.
Trees are important.
Yeah.
Trees are important, and so is land. Aaron, the main reason we've got you on today is because you're just putting out a book called Tairāwhiti, Pine, Prophet and the Cyclone, which pulls together your reporting on what's happened there, not just with forestry, land use / the cyclones, but just the current situation and the background to it. Thank you very much for coming on and talking to us about this.
No, thank you.
Now, tell us about this book. What prompted you to write this book? It's published by Bridget William Books.
Well, as you mentioned, it started off as a journalism project. Obviously, the cyclone hit and it was all over the news, and I'd been an agribusiness reporter in the early part of my career, and I kind of knew that often these events get a lot of saturation coverage, wall-to-wall coverage in the first sort of day or so after or the weeks even after the event, and then they kind of fade off the headlines, and often that's when the real hard, ugly things, kind of the grind to sort of recovery sort of kicks in. And I mean, just logistically, I didn't have a helicopter budget to sort of drop in there like some media outlets, who should remain nameless. But so yeah, and I did get up to the Hawke's Bay and covered what was going on there with some of the marae there, communities. But I sort of had it penciled in the back of my mind that I needed to get up to the East Coast, because in an isolated region like that's even more isolated after a cyclone like this. And so that's what I did, and I didn't really know where I was going to go with it. I mean, the whole slash issue was really an obvious thing that had happened, but it was, I think the old adage that one photo can say 1,000 words didn't really apply, because it's like, well, where did all this crap come from? And so I had a whole lot of questions. I had been up there in 2018, I think it was, when there was a big event that hit Tolaga. And I was doing a photo shoot up there, and one of the guys, Hilton Collier actually, who I spoke to for this series, took me around the back roads and showed me some of the damage. And I kind of became a little bit aware of it, but wasn't really too au fait with what was behind it, and so it just, that issue became the focus, and that was the launch pad for the series.
And what surprised you when you went up this time? You're right, we've all seen the pictures, but what was behind it?
Well, you can see all the images in the rivers and on the beaches, but you really have to understand it. You got to go back up into the ranges.
Yeah.
And I travelled up and down the coast, but I went up behind Tokomaru Bay, and you could see there's just this mass of carpet of green kind of pine trees. But then there's also these great big patches that have just been clear felled, and you can see all this rubbish lying on these hills, just waiting for the next storm to come along and sweep them down into the creeks and rivers. And so that's where it's coming from. And then you get into who owns this, why is this being allowed to happen? Where did it all start? Why is it only happening now? And then, that's really, as a journalist, all you've got is questions.
Yeah, so just take us back here. This sort of started with bowler in a way back in the 80s. There was a lot of, sheep and beef country which had a few slips, and people thought, we'll plant some forests. And then, of course, in more recent years, the emissions trading scheme has created a revenue stream for a whole bunch of people. Why is there no control or measures to ensure that the forestry companies don't leave such a mess? Because it seems like that's the sort of thing that wasn't thought about when everyone thought, right, let's plant it.
Well, yeah, in one sense it started with bowler, but in another sense bowler was kind of kind of an end point, because you had obviously the sheep and beef industry in there for a long time, and that the clear felling of the native bush led to, from very early on, from the sort of 19th century, certainly the early 20th century onwards, this massive kind of erosion, and that was recognised very early. And then when bowler hit, that really just amplified all of those problems that had been going on for years. And so everybody just thought, right, let's, and one of the people I spoke to was a scientist, Mike Martin, who tracked the whole history of that. And then there had been some planting of pine forestry a bit earlier. There had been some moves to do that, and he and other scientists noticed very clearly that where there were trees, whether it was forest, pine forest or indigenous, the erosion wasn't as bad.
Yeah.
And so then there was this whole East Coast Forestry project where they basically threw a whole lot of money in there to plant trees to try and stop the erosion, without thinking ahead sort of 30 years. So what happens when we cut them all down?
Yeah. Aaron, may I ask you? I haven't looked at this book, and I want to ask you a couple of forestry questions before I ask you some stuff about other work you've done. Why don't we plant, or does your book address, or do you now know why we don't plant or appear to research more planting of native species? Yeah. And I guess the second one, if I may, is I heard a forestry guy from Tairāwhiti talking on the radio recently. He said not only should it never have been cleared for sheep and beef, it should never have been planted in Pinus radiata after that as well.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. There's a whole lot of issues wrapped up in the question you asked there, but the short answer, if you're talking about the emissions trading scheme, pines grow fast. Their full life cycle was about 30 years. And theoretically they suck up carbon faster, and so there's this kind of, and this is that the equations, you're including economic equations, you're including scientific equations and a whole lot of other things, and somehow coming up with these figures. So pine grows faster, and because indigenous forestry doesn't grow as fast, theoretically it's the curve that it absorbs.
Quite. It's an
carbon.
economic, yeah, because I mean, somebody is of course pointing out to me that I'm an idiot and that it just doesn't grow fast enough. But the objectives for planting an area like that, like let me just, I know that area where you were describing a little bit, Wairoa and so on, but I recently went to a place in Taranaki where I went over a saddle from Stratford to a place called Mangamingi, which is on the way into the volcanic plateau, and it had been cleared. And a friend of mine used to be a farmer there, and it was the spikiest, nastiest, slippiest, toughest, pointiest, prickliest. It was like corrugated cardboard as far as you could see, and it should clearly never have been cleared. And that will be pine, I imagine, in 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, well, there's kind of... you're talking about that central plateau. I mean, Taranaki is probably different again, but you've got quite different soils. Like, I drove up through the central North Island shortly after the cyclone, and there was that... I can't remember exactly where it is. It's just past Taupo.
Yeah.
And there's somehow the cyclone's gone through there and just sheared off a whole lot of pine trees, and it's just snapped them off. And it's the soil is obviously volcanic, and the roots can get a lot firmer hold. And in the Tairāwhiti on the East Coast, it's a totally different soil type, and it's steeper. And so that's, I mean, you could argue about pine all day in different parts of the country, but certainly in Tairāwhiti, the soil type is so soft and so prone to erosion that, for example, up behind Tokomaru Bay, it wasn't just the clear felled land that slipped. There was a whole, like, full-grown pines had just been swept down this gully, and that's how prone to erosion it is. Sorry, I'm not sure if I've asked you questions there.
Well, no, you did. So, may I also I want to expand a little bit on this, because Rob, Bernard, it's the first time you've been on. You're welcome anytime. You're definitely a friend of the pod, as people say. We sometimes start the top of the hour with a discussion about media, and I have mentioned you on that before. And I just want to say, I was one of the Voyager judges when we gave you the Investigative Reporter of the Year award, I think 2 years ago, for your work on, I think it was primarily Lake Alice, but really this whole question of abuse and care.
Yeah.
And, having judged a lot of those things over the years, I always look for what the actual impact is. And you almost solely generated a Royal Commission of Inquiry, which is now reported. Could you just share with the audience a little bit about that sense of impact? I mean, you're looking bashful and shy.
The impact, yeah, it's been a strange journey, because I think I wrote in a piece immediately after the report landed. It just feels like it felt like I'd been standing in the desert, sort of looking at this UFO and sort of, can anyone else see this? Because it seemed so kind of huge and so outrageous, really, that it's like, why is this not getting the attention it deserved? And I just felt like I couldn't walk away. And I kind of made a naive, probably a stupid commitment to myself at the start, that I'd sort of done this Google search to see what previous coverage had been done, and there had been significant coverage over the years, but it just hadn't. There'd been a couple of stories, and then nothing would change, and people would move on. And I just thought, I don't really want to join that club. And so I kind of committed to trying to get to a point where something changed for the victims. And I didn't know what that looked like. And that's what I mean. It was kind of naive, and it just felt like I was on this treadmill. So when the report landed, I was quite anxious to see what it was going to say. I thought that there's no way they couldn't come up with something pretty significant. But I was more anxious about what the government's response was going to be, because it just seemed... They seem to be wanting to repeat it all again. Let's have boot camps, yay.
That was going to be my next question, but carry on.
Well, yeah, and I was pleasantly surprised, I have to say, by Prime Minister's statements in the House. They're words at this point, and they will need to be backed up. But it was a turning point for me, especially to hear him say this is torture regarding Lake Alice, because there'd been a lot of resistance, a lot of attempts to not say that. And for him to say it in Parliament with victims sitting there hearing that was, it was pretty bit of lump in the throat moment. And it was, I guess, a sense for me of relief. You know, there was one whole volume that was about the connection between Kohiteria and Hokio and other welfare homes and gangs. And
it has consequences.
Well, that was the first thing I opened, and it's like, yeah, I've already written this.
Yeah.
And so that was a validation in a sense, but more so validation for the victims that they had been silenced as children and silenced as adults. And
Aaron, is the difference that you sheeted home, as it were, particularly through your own work, but also the Royal Commission, but with the addition of the Royal Commission, you sheeted home the responsibility. It wasn't just another gruesome, almost impossible to read set of stories about victims, which of course are incredibly important, in fact the most important, but sheeting home the responsibility, whether it's Dilworth, whether it's Lake Alice, whether it's the one that I was so shocked by was the place near Levin, where the staff and so on were organising little sort of parties for people to come in and have access to these kids. I mean, it's shocking.
Yeah, that's the place you're referring to. There's Kimberley, which was for disabled, intellectually handicapped. I don't know, there's a cluster of them. There was Hokio, there was Kohiteria, Kimberley. I don't know what was going on there, but in Levin, which I live in now. But yeah, it's just, to me, there was two parts of the story. There was the abuse and the hearing the victims, but then it's like they're banging their heads against this wall, and they have for like their whole lives, trying to hold someone accountable or fighting back. And what's going on there, and once you started to peel back those layers and see it wasn't just some arbitrary thing, they were deliberately, and I've just written a summary, I don't know if anyone will publish it because it's longer than that piece you talked about, just the lengths that people at the very top went to cover it up.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
Right up to the ninth floor.
Why did they
just
do
before
that?
Bernard, just let me go one step further, please. The government has announced the boot camps, and also Bernard did some work today about the decisions about care for the disabled. Neither of those things has to be good for the conditions under which people are treated, literally. Sorry, Bernard, you go ahead after this.
Well, it's interesting you say treated, but one of the things I've said to a couple of people is we don't seem to recognise trauma in this country. We seem to punish it and just regard the person who's maybe displaying behaviour that's unacceptable as just they're the problem. I mean, there's one of the victims that always stands out to me in his file. You can see he's running away and acting up because he's being sexually abused, and you got all these psychologists and psychiatrists writing all these reports about him, but not sort of sitting down and saying, "You're right, mate, what's going on?" And they escalate it. He goes to Hokio, and then he ends up at Lake Alice, and the trauma just compounds, and it just like, well, and then you look at boot camps, and it's like, well, by the time those kids get there at the age of 15, they've already been through the mill. And then you're going to have some guy sort of standing there barking at them and
burying them in a shallow grave in Great Barrier.
Yeah, and I know, I can only imagine, because I know some of these older guys, that the response from those kids is going to be, well, F you, and that's going to escalate it again because they have had a guts full, I imagine some of those kids. And yeah, anyway.
So, Aaron, I just wondered why you think the Crown, the government, the Crown Prosecution Office, the heads of departments who are sending emails to each other saying fight this one in the courts hard, just demonstrate they won't get any money. Why do you think there was so much aggressive pushing down and back by very powerful people sitting on lots of money in the Crown who really, got involved? It wasn't like they were, just not doing anything. They were doing things to stop it.
Yeah. I mean, short answer, first, there's two things. One, money. The legal and financial liability, they started very early on to see dollar signs. And when you're talking about hundreds of kids in Lake Alice and then thousands in these other institutions, it's like, well, what does that look like if we have to actually face some consequences? So that's the main thing, and you can see the drivers all through there. I think the other thing, though, that it's kind of dawned on me and I've asked myself this question: why did you just push for 30 odd years you were fighting this? And I think if you look at some of the victims, they've ended up, if you go through the report, it's 80% is the figure that keeps coming up were Māori.
Yeah.
They were from poor backgrounds generally, and that's not just Māori, the Pākehā kids as well. Many of them as adults ended up as gang members in prisons, or just generally disadvantaged. Not everybody ended up in those places, but they always ended up in these disadvantaged positions. And I think really it's when you're making political decisions, it's what can you get away with.
Yeah.
And when people are in those sorts of categories, they're politically expedient. They don't have a voice. They don't have a lobbyist kind of, you had lawyers like Sonia Cooper fighting their corner, but she was getting buried. And so you don't have this sort of pushback. I mean, from an organised pushback, because if they haven't got an education, well, they can't sort of go and,
They've got no voice. You
and they've
gave
got
them
no
a voice.
Trauma doesn't exactly help the situation either. No. So they were disadvantaged in every way, and so the imbalance in power was just absolute. It was just so an abusive power, really.
Aaron, I don't have many heroes in journalism. In fact, I have. I really avoid it. But and we haven't met, but I've admired your work so much, and I really appreciate you addressing this as well as the Tai Rafferty story. I know Bernard wanted to talk to you mainly about pine trees, but it would have been a crime to not get you to talk about that. So thank you, and please come on again at some stage if you would.
And I'll add my thanks there as well, Aaron. I am very proud of some things I've done in my career, one of which was to help get newsrooms started and to be slightly useful in trying to get that journalism out there, and the work you've done with lots of other people to get it out through newsroom has made me particularly proud and also thrilled, because in 2017 when we launched it, it wasn't there, and it may well be that if it hadn't come up, some of your journalism might not have been out there. No. And I am really grateful that it's still going really, really strong, and that your stuff is coming out.
Bernard already was my hero, Aaron. So you're a new one, but yeah.
Aaron, so thank you.
This is usually a love-in,
and we'd love to have you on again. I'm sure you'll be doing lots of fantastic work which we can help amplify, and please, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much, Aaron. No, skateboarding. Should we do the quick skateboarding dog before we go, Bernard? Because it's a goodie today. I mean, I'm not going to do the one I told you about. I'm going to do the other one.
Good.
Which is, I think we've all been there on an aeroplane when there's been a screaming child and thought, oh, God, am I going to fly to London with a screaming child? And two Chinese people, women, on a flight took, with permission of the grandparents of the child who were having difficulty keeping the child quiet, people, they said, had put tissues in their ears to dampen the noise of the child, and moved seats and so on. These two women took the child, it would appear, to the bathroom in the aeroplane and said to the child, "If you make any noise again, we will leave you here alone."
Oh dear.
Yeah. And what they said that they were trying to do was set some rules for the child.
Rules, yes.
I think, children, little kids, set some rules. Anyway, off you go.
Yeah, no, that sounds familiar and sort of scary. Peter, thank you very much.
But I could tell you the other, actually, what I could recommend is what I did with my child was pretty much perfect all the time, but we did take one trip from London to New Zealand and gave her a thing called Valagan. And I'm pretty sure that we could have put her in the overhead lockers and left her there for 28 hours if we'd needed to.
Yikes. No.
Oh, Christ, I'll probably get into one of those. Oh, my God. A bit late, but thank you.
Yeah. No, there's a solution for all this, Peter, is we should all just avoid flying long haul.
Bernard. Yeah.
And on that note, that bombshell, I shall sign off. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm Bernard Hickey for the Kaka, Peter Bale.
And thanks for all the feedback, which Bernard hasn't read, but I have, and I appreciate the audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Ka kite anō mā te
Bye-bye.
wā. Bye-bye.